Hello everybody and welcome to your algebra recording. We are in week 6. At this time, please make sure that you have your math notebook out, and we're going to start using your math notebook for a couple warm-up questions. These warm-up questions are stemming from last week where we investigated quadratic equations. And we know when we graph a quadratic equation, we get a parabola. And the parabola is a nice U shape. So we get that nice U shape that can open up or down. And last week we talked about how parabolas can shift. We can make them wider, we can make them narrower, we can move them up, and we can move them down. And we looked at how the equations or functions can give us some clues about the movements that are happening to our parabolas. So the two warm-up questions you have is all about transformations of parabolas. So the first question says, which has a vertex below the x-axis? So which equation has a vertex below the x-axis? Is it g of x equals x squared plus 5 or g of x equals x squared minus 7? So look at those equations and look for the clues that tell you where the vertex would be located. And then the second question is about the width of a parabola, whether it gets wider or narrower. And you need to tell me which function is wider. Is it the g of x equals 4x squared or g of x equals 1/2 x squared? So go ahead and try these two problems in your math notebook. And when you're ready to check your work with mine, go ahead and click play. All right, so for number 1, let's compare the two functions. Both of them have this x squared term, but what's different is what comes after the x squared. Here we've got plus 5 and here we've got minus 7. So how does that move the parabola? Well, this plus 5 is just going to take the parent function x squared and move it up 5 units. Where this function over here, we're going to take the parent function and move it down 7 units. So to get a vertex below the x-axis, we need to take, if this is our parabola, let's say we've graphed this and this is our x-axis and this is our y, to move it down below the x-axis, we need to do just that. We need to move it down. So that means that this function right here, the g of x, x squared minus 7, that moving it down is going to take our vertex and move it below the x-axis. If this were the parent function, the vertex, remember, sits right on the y-axis right here. So just a quick note about that. And then our second question, which graph is wider? When we've got a number greater than 1 that's being multiplied by the x squared, or a number that's less than 1 and greater than 0 being multiplied by the x squared. So if this one right here is going to create a wider graph, when we've got a coefficient of less than 1 but greater than 0, so like a fraction, then we're going to have a wider. It makes our graph wider. All right, so we are ready to move on. What are we doing this week? So this week, you are going to start the week with taking a quiz. That's going to cover the first 5 sessions of Unit 6. So just a reminder, everything that we've been studying in Unit 6 so far is all pertaining to quadratic functions. So we've looked at how to graph quadratic functions, how we can translate quadratic functions, move those parabolas up, down, left, right, make them widen, make them more narrow. And just remember, a good way to study for the quiz is to go back and make sure you've submitted all your assignments so far in in Unit 6, and then redo any low scoring assignments. And just remember, you do need to email me when you redo a low scoring assignment. And then you're going to move on to session 5, where we're going to look at how can we solve quadratic functions. And one way we can solve quadratic functions is by graphing. All right, let's move on. How we can solve parabolas or quadratic functions by graphing. How do we solve quadratic functions by graphing? So when we graph a quadratic equation, it's called a parabola. Remember, that's our fancy term we called for the graph of a quadratic function. So wherever the parabola intersects the x-axis, that is where your solutions are. Those are called the zeros, or sometimes it's referred to as the roots. So the solutions is where we have our parabola cross the x-axis. So remember, your x-axis is that horizontal axis. So wherever it crosses, so look at this one, we've got it crosses here and it crosses here. Those are what we call our zeros, and they're essentially our solutions. So if we were looking at this parabola and we wanted to find the zeros, sometimes the question will say find the zeros. You want to find where it crosses the x-axis. And where does it cross? Well, it crosses at x is equal to -3, so that would be one of our solutions. And then this solution over here would be x equals 3. So those would be our two solutions to what are the zeros of the quadratic function. Looking at this graph over here on the right, it doesn't cross the x-axis, does it? So in this case, it would say we would have no solutions. And sometimes we don't have solution. We don't have any zeros. So we're looking to see where our graph crosses the x-axis. So good thing we learned how to graph quadratic functions last week, right? So all you're going to do this week when you are trying to solve by graphing, you'll graph the quadratic function and you'll look to see where your graph intersects the x-axis. You're also going to learn how to use a graphing calculator so that you don't have to graph by hand. If you don't have a graphing calculator, I did include a link to an online graphing calculator that you can use. So you'll learn how to do that as well this week. So again, the big takeaway is that sometimes your graph might cross in two places. Sometimes it might cross in one if you've got the vertex sitting on the x-axis. And sometimes you might not have any solutions if it doesn't cross at all, the x-axis. So I'm going to move on now. All right. So we are doing the key phrase assignment for week 6. So we are in week 6. Make sure that everybody's going to the right one. And let me put it up really quick. All right, so one of the things you learned in this recording was how we can solve the quadratic equations by graphing and looking for the zeros. So I have a parabola graphed right here. How many solutions would this quadratic function graphed to the left have? How many solutions would that quadratic function have? That's what you need to answer for your key phrase assignment. Remember that assignments this week, although it says Friday as a due date, remember you can work over the weekend, and that's totally fine. I spoke about this earlier in this recording. Please make sure you're watching the entire recording and you're not missing that important message about the due dates this week. Have a great rest of your week, and let me know if you have any questions.